Sometimes the hardest decisions we make with love in our hearts lead to the deepest regrets of our lives. Every parent knows the weight of choosing between what we need and what we cherish most. Daniel Miller, a 57-year-old Amish farmer, sold his workhorse Isaac to pay his late wife's medical bills. The buyer promised Isaac would retire peacefully on a farm. 4 months later, Daniel found Isaac starving on a city street, abandoned and broken. The horse who had been his companion for 15 years was now just skin and bones. Daniel faced a choice that would change everything. He could walk away and follow his community's rules, or he could take Isaac back and fight for the animal he never should have sold. What happened next tested every belief Daniel held dear about forgiveness, loyalty, and second chances. Can a man's love really heal the damage that desperation and guilt have caused? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County when Daniel Miller stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the cornfields gold. At 57, his beard had turned more salt than pepper, and the lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and sorrow. The silence that greeted him each dawn had grown familiar over the past 2 years, though it never felt comfortable. Inside the farmhouse, Martha's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, its hand-carved walnut surface worn, smooth by decades of use. Daniel had crafted it himself as a wedding gift 35 years ago, back when his hands were steadier and his heart lighter. Now it held more than recipes. It held the memory of every meal they'd shared, every holiday tradition, every quiet evening when Martha would read aloud from her worn index cards while he cleaned the dishes. The box had become a shrine of sorts, though Daniel would never admit such a thing to Bishop Yoder or the other church elders. The Amish didn't believe in dwelling on the past, but some mornings, when the loneliness pressed against his chest like a stone, he would open the wooden lid and breathe in the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon that still lingered on the yellowed papers. This morning was different, though. This morning, the recipe box reminded him not just of what he'd lost, but of what he'd been forced to give away. Isaac should have been waiting in the paddock by now, his massive head hanging over the fence rail, ears pricked forward in anticipation of his morning oats. For 15 years, that had been their routine. Daniel on the porch with his coffee, Isaac in the field, both of them greeting the day in companionable silence. The Clydesdale had been more than a workhorse. He'd been a constant, a reliable presence when everything else in Daniel's world seemed to shift like sand. The empty paddock mocked him now, its gate hanging slightly askew on hinges that needed oil. Daniel had been meaning to fix it for months. But what was the point? Isaac wouldn't be coming back to push against it with his broad chest, looking for treats hidden in Daniel's coat pockets. 4 months. It had been 4 months since Carl Henderson had loaded Isaac into his horse trailer, promising Daniel that the old Clydesdale would spend his remaining years pulling light loads on a small farm outside Reading. Henderson had seemed like a decent man, clean clothes, firm handshake, spoke kindly about respecting the horse's advanced age. He'd paid cash, counted out the bills slowly while praising Isaac's condition and gentle nature. He'll be treated like family, Henderson had assured Daniel, running his hand along Isaac's neck. I've got grandchildren who'll spoil him rotten with apples and sugar cubes. The money had covered Martha's final hospital bills, with enough left over to repair the barn roof and replace the broken harness that had been mended too many times. Practical considerations, the kind of decisions a responsible Amish man made without sentiment or regret. At least, that's what Daniel had told himself every morning since, standing on this porch, staring at that empty field. The community had supported his decision, naturally. Bishop Yoder had even stopped by the day after the sale to commend Daniel for his wisdom. The Lord provides what we need, when we need it, the bishop had said. his weathered hands folded behind his back as they watched the sunset together. Sometimes that provision comes through sacrifice. Daniel had nodded and murmured agreement, but the bishop's words sat heavy in his stomach like stones. If the Lord provided what they needed, why had he taken Martha? Why had the medical bills piled up like autumn leaves, no matter how many times Daniel swept them away? Why had Isaac, faithful, steady Isaac, become the price of his wife's final months? Martha would have understood. She'd always been practical about their animals, never letting sentiment interfere with farm business. But she'd also loved Isaac. In her quiet way, bringing him carrots from her garden and braiding flowers into his mane during spring festivals. The horse had pulled their courting buggy, had worked their fields through good harvests and lean years, had stood patient and still while their neighbor children learned to drive. Now those children were grown and married, starting families of their own. Daniel's own children had moved to other communities, drawn away by marriage and opportunity. His son Abraham had offered to help with the medical bills, but Daniel had refused. A man provided for his own family. He didn't burden his children with his troubles. The decision to sell Isaac had been his alone, made in the quiet hours before dawn while Martha slept her medication-induced sleep. He'd stood in the barn, running his hands over Isaac's winter coat, and made his choice. The horse was old, nearly 20, and the arthritis in his front legs meant he couldn't pull the heavy plow anymore. It made sense to find him a retirement home while he still had value to someone. That's what Daniel had told himself. That's what he'd told the buyer and the bishop and anyone else who'd listened. But standing here now, coffee growing cold in his hands, Daniel could admit the truth that he'd been avoiding for 4 months. He'd sold Isaac because he couldn't bear to look at the horse every day and remember Martha's final words. "Promise me you'll take care of him," she'd whispered from her hospital bed, her hands surprisingly strong despite her failing body. "Isaac's been good to us. Promise me." Daniel had promised, had held her hand, and sworn that Isaac would live out his days in comfort and dignity. It was the last promise he'd made to his wife, the last words they'd shared before the morphine claimed her completely. 3 days after the funeral, when the casseroles had been eaten and the visitors had gone home to their own lives, Daniel had stood in the barn and broken that promise. He'd told himself it was necessary, that Martha would have understood, that the dead don't hold the living to impossible standards. But promises made to the dying carry a different weight than promises made to the living. They settle into a man's bones and make themselves at home, reminding him of their presence with every breath. The morning sun had burned away the mist now, revealing the stark emptiness of the paddock in harsh detail. Daniel finished his coffee and turned to go inside, but stopped when he noticed a letter tucked into the screen door's frame. The postmark showed yesterday's date, and the return address made his heart skip. Dr. Sarah Chun, Lancaster General Hospital. Martha's oncologist. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, expecting another bill, another reminder of the debt he'd thought he'd settled. Instead, he found a brief note written in careful cursive. "Mr. Miller, I wanted to inform you that an error in our billing department has been discovered. You were overcharged for several procedures during your wife's final treatment. Please find enclosed a refund check, along with our sincere apologies for any hardship this error may have caused." The check was for $3,000, enough to have covered Isaac's sale price with money left over. Daniel sank into Martha's rocking chair on the porch, the check fluttering in his shaking hands. The irony was sharp enough to cut. If this letter had come 4 months ago, Isaac would still be here. The horse would be waiting in his stall for breakfast, and Daniel's promise to Martha would still be whole. But it had come now, when apology and money could do nothing to change what had been done. Isaac was gone, sold to a man who'd promised kindness, but delivered God only knew what. The horse could be anywhere, another farm, another state, another life entirely. Or he could be suffering. The thought hit Daniel like a physical blow, doubling him over in the rocking chair. What if Henderson had lied? What if Isaac wasn't living peacefully in some gentle pasture, but working harder than his old bones could handle? What if the arthritis had worsened and no one cared enough to notice? What if Daniel forced himself to stop? Such thoughts led nowhere good, and the Amish believed in accepting what couldn't be changed. Isaac was beyond his reach now, beyond his care and protection. The best Daniel could do was learn from his mistake and trust that the Lord would somehow make it right. But as he sat in Martha's chair, holding the check that represented his wife's pain and his own guilt, Daniel made a decision that would have surprised Bishop Yoder. He was going to find out what had happened to Isaac. He was going to Reading, to Henderson's farm, to see for himself whether his old friend was truly at peace. It wasn't about changing. The past Daniel wasn't fool enough to think he could undo what had been done. But a man should know the consequences of his choices, even when those consequences were too painful to bear. Especially then. The morning was warm, but Daniel pulled his coat tight around his shoulders as he walked to the barn to hitch his remaining horse to the buggy. Some journeys required preparation, and this one would take him further from home than he'd traveled in years. Martha's recipe box sat waiting in the kitchen, holding its store of memories and traditions. But today, Daniel was going to make his own recipe, 1 part courage, 1 part guilt, and a full measure of love that had come too late to matter. The empty paddock watched him go, its gate swinging gently in the morning breeze, like a wave goodbye to the life he'd known before he learned that some promises, once broken, echo forever. The city bus wheezed to a stop on Market Street, and Daniel Miller stepped down onto pavement still damp from the previous night's rain. The noise hit him first: car horns, construction equipment, voices raised in a dozen different languages. Assault on ears accustomed to the gentle sounds of wind through corn and horses' hooves on dirt roads. He clutched the crumpled bus ticket in his coat pocket, already regretting the decision that had brought him here. Philadelphia wasn't where he'd intended to be. The bus to Reading had broken down 20 miles outside the city, and Daniel had accepted the driver's offer of a transfer rather than wait 4 hours for another coach. "You can catch a connecting bus from Center City," the driver had explained, "or maybe find a rideshare willing to take you the rest of the way." Now, standing amid the urban chaos with his black wool coat and wide-brimmed hat marking him as clearly as a beacon, Daniel wondered if the breakdown had been a sign from God that he should abandon this foolish quest. The Amish didn't believe in omens, but they did believe in providence, and perhaps providence was steering him away from answers that would only bring more pain. But he'd come this far, spent money he couldn't easily afford on bus fare, and a day away from farm work that wouldn't wait. He would find the connecting bus, make his way to Reading, and satisfy himself that Isaac was well cared for. Then he could return home with his conscience clear and his promise to Martha, if not fulfilled, at least properly mourned. The medical supply store on his list was only 6 blocks away, according to the directions he'd written in his careful script. Daniel needed insulin supplies for old Heinrich Mueller, whose diabetes had worsened since his wife passed. It was a practical errand that justified the trip, gave him a legitimate reason to be in the city beyond his search for Isaac. He'd walked 3 blocks when he saw the horse stop at first. Daniel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. That guilt and longing had conjured the impossible from shadow and wishful thinking. But as he moved closer, pushing through a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, the mirage solidified into heartbreaking reality. Isaac lay on his side in a narrow alley between 2 brick buildings, his massive frame reduced to sharp angles of bone beneath a coat that had lost its winter thickness and summer shine. His ribs showed clearly through skin that seemed too tight, and his once proud head rested against the grimy concrete as if he no longer had the strength to lift it. "Poor old thing's been here since yesterday," a woman was saying to her companion. Someone called animal control, but they're backed up. Might be tomorrow before they get here. Shame, the other woman replied. But what can you do? Probably better to put him out of his misery at this point. Daniel pushed past them without apology, dropping to his knees beside the horse's head. Isaac's eyes were open but unfocused, the bright intelligence that Daniel remembered dimmed to a dull amber. The horse's breathing was shallow, labored, and when Daniel placed his hand on Isaac's neck, he could feel each rib through the stretched skin. Isaac, Daniel whispered, his voice cracking on the name. Oh, my friend, what have they done to you? At the sound of his voice, Isaac's ear twitched. The horse's eye rolled toward Daniel, and for a moment, the old recognition flickered there, faint but unmistakable. Sir, you need to step back. A young man in a security uniform approached, his hand resting on his radio. This animal is sick. Animal control is coming to handle the situation. Daniel looked up, his vision blurred with tears he couldn't stop. This is my horse, he said simply. The security guard frowned. Your horse? Sir, this animal was abandoned here. If it was your horse, why would you leave it in an alley to die? The accusation hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he couldn't argue with it. In every way that mattered, he had abandoned Isaac. He trusted a stranger's promises over his own instincts, had chosen money over loyalty, had broken the most important promise of his life for the sake of practical necessity. I sold him, Daniel admitted, his hand still resting on Isaac's neck. 4 months ago, I was told he would be cared for. Well, somebody lied to you. A new voice entered the conversation, harsh and unforgiving. A middle-aged man in work clothes pushed through the crowd, his face set in angry lines. That's what happens when you people dump your old animals on the first buyer who shows up with cash. Daniel looked up at the stranger, confusion mixing with his grief. I don't understand. Carl Henderson, the man said, as if the name should explain everything. Ring a bell? He's been running this scam for 2 years now, buying up worn-out farm animals from families who don't ask enough questions. Promises them good homes, then works the animals until they drop or sells them to whoever will take them off his hands. The world seemed to tilt around Daniel, the sounds of the city fading to a distant hum. Henderson said Isaac would retire on his farm. He had grandchildren who would spoil him. The man laughed bitterly. Henderson's got a farm, all right. A feedlot operation where he fattens cattle for slaughter. Your horse has been pulling delivery wagons for the past 4 months, loading hay bales and feed sacks until his joints gave out. When he couldn't work anymore, Henderson dumped him here rather than pay for a veterinarian or proper disposal. Daniel felt something break inside his chest, a physical snapping that left him struggling to breathe. Isaac had suffered. For 4 months, while Daniel had been telling himself that his horse was living peacefully in some gentle pasture, Isaac had been worked beyond his endurance by a man who saw him as nothing more than a tool to be used until it broke. Where is Henderson now? Daniel asked, surprised by the steel in his own voice. Gone, the man replied. Took off 3 days ago when the authorities started asking questions. Left behind a dozen animals in various states of neglect. Your horse was one of the lucky ones. At least he made it to the city before collapsing. Daniel turned back to Isaac, whose breathing had grown more shallow while they talked. The horse's eye found his again, and in that look, Daniel saw not accusation but something far worse, forgiveness. Isaac knew who he was, remembered there. 15 years together, and bore no grudge for the abandonment that had led to this moment. What are you going to do? The security guard asked, his earlier authority replaced by uncomfortable sympathy. Daniel didn't hesitate. I'm taking him home. Sir, I don't think you understand the situation. This animal is severely malnourished and dehydrated. He needs immediate veterinary care, and even then I'll find a veterinarian. Daniel stood, his decision crystallizing. With each word, I'll find whatever he needs. But I'm not leaving him here to die alone in an alley. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the drama and the unusual sight of an Amish man kneeling beside a dying horse in the middle of the city. Daniel heard whispers, saw phones raised to capture photos or video, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the promise he'd made to Martha, the promise he'd broken, and the chance, however slim, to make it right. How are you planning to transport a horse this size? The security guard asked practically. And where? Would you take him? Daniel looked around the alley, then up at the narrow slice of sky visible between the buildings. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward evening, and Isaac wouldn't survive another night on the streets. But there had to be a way. There was always a way, if a man was willing to pay the price. I need to find a horse trailer, Daniel said, his mind already working through the logistics. And a place where he can rest safely while he recovers. In the city, the security guard shook his head. Sir, this isn't farm country. There aren't any stables or— Then I'll make one, Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of a man who had finally found his purpose. Whatever Isaac needs, I'll provide. I owe him that much. As if summoned by his words, Isaac's head lifted slightly from the pavement. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was movement nonetheless. The first sign that the horse Daniel remembered might still be fighting somewhere inside this broken shell. Daniel knelt again and placed both hands on Isaac's neck, feeling the weak but steady pulse beneath his palms. Hold on, old friend, he whispered. We're going home. But first, they would need to find a way to survive the city that had nearly killed them both. The empty veterinary medicine bottle had once held Martha's pain medication morphine sulfate, prescribed during her final weeks when ordinary painkillers no longer touched the cancer that was consuming her from within. Daniel had kept the small, amber bottle without really knowing why, tucked away in his coat pocket like a talisman of loss. Now, as he filled it with clean water from a gas station bathroom, the bottle took on new meaning. It would help save what he hadn't been able to save before. Finding transportation for Isaac had proven easier than expected, though the solution came with its own complications. The crowd in the alley had included Maria Santos, a Puerto Rican woman whose brother owned a small landscaping business. When she overheard Daniel's desperate inquiries about horse trailers, she'd stepped forward with an offer that seemed heaven-sent. My brother Hor has a truck, she'd said, in accented but clear English. He moves equipment, sometimes horses for the mounted police. He might help if you can pay him. Jorge had arrived within an hour, his pickup truck pulling a weathered but sturdy horse trailer. He was a compact man with calloused hands and kind eyes, and he'd taken one look at Isaac before shaking his head gravely. This horse is very sick. Hermano, Jorge had told Daniel. You sure he's going to make it? Daniel had met his gaze steadily. I have to try. Together, they'd managed to get Isaac to his feet, a process that had taken 30 minutes and left all three men sweating despite the cool afternoon air. The horse had struggled gamely, his legs shaking with the effort, but somehow he'd found the strength to stand. Getting him into the trailer had been another ordeal entirely, requiring gentle coaxing and the support of a makeshift sling Hor had fashioned from moving blankets. Now, as the truck navigated Philadelphia's congested streets, Daniel sat in the trailer's small front compartment, watching Isaac through the window that separated them. The horse swayed with each turn, his legs braced wide for balance, but he remained upright. It was progress, however small. Where exactly are we going? Jorge called through the open window between cab and trailer. It was the question Daniel had been avoiding for the past hour. He couldn't take Isaac home, not yet. The horse needed immediate care, and the farm was still 2 hours away by trailer. Besides, Daniel wasn't ready to face his community's questions about why he'd ventured into the city, only to return with the horse he'd sold 4 months ago. That conversation would come, but Isaac's survival took precedence over explanations. Need to find somewhere in the city where he can rest, Daniel replied. Somewhere with shelter and space for him to heal. Jorge was quiet for several minutes, navigating around a stalled bus and through an intersection where the traffic lights seemed to cycle through its colors without any discernible pattern. Finally, he spoke again. "I know a place," he said. "My cousin owns some property on the edge of the city-old industrial buildings, mostly empty now. There's a warehouse with loading bays that might work, but it's going to cost you money." Daniel fingered the hospital refund check in his coat pocket. $3,000 that had come 4 months too late to prevent this situation, but perhaps just in time to address it. How much? For the space, maybe $200 a week. For me to help you set it up, keep bringing supplies. Jorge shrugged. We can work something out. $200 a week would drain Daniel's savings within a month, even with the unexpected refund. But as he watched Isaac struggle to maintain his balance, the cost seemed irrelevant. Some debts couldn't be measured in dollars. The warehouse district sprawled along the Schuylkill River, a landscape of brick and rust where Philadelphia's industrial past lingered in abandoned buildings and overgrown lots. Jorge's cousin's property sat at the end of a dead-end street, separated from its neighbors by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It wasn't beautiful, but it was private. The building itself was a relic of the 1950s, built to house manufacturing equipment that had long since moved overseas. The loading dock was wide enough to back the trailer up to, and the interior space, while concrete and echoing, was dry and secure. Most importantly, it had running water and electrical power. The loading bay doors don't work anymore, Jorge's cousin Carlos explained as he showed them around. He was older than Jorge, with silver threading through his black hair, and the careful manner of a man who'd learned not to ask too many questions about his tenants. But they'll stay open if you need air circulation. There's an office space upstairs if you need somewhere to sleep. Sleep. Daniel hadn't considered that he might need to stay in the city overnight, but looking at Isaac, now head hanging low, legs trembling with exhaustion, he realized that leaving the horse alone would be unthinkable. Isaac had been abandoned once. It wouldn't happen again. They unloaded Isaac into the warehouse as the sun set over the Philadelphia skyline, its orange light filtering through grimy windows to cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The horse moved carefully, each step deliberate and painful, but he moved under his own power. Once inside, he stood with his head low, breathing heavily but stable. Daniel had brought few supplies from the farm. He'd expected to be home by evening, but Maria had stopped at a feed store on the way to the warehouse, using money from Daniel's dwindling cash reserves to buy hay, oats, and basic care supplies. It wasn't enough for a full recovery, but it was a start. As Jorge and Carlos prepared to leave for the night, promising to return in the morning with more supplies, Daniel found himself alone with Isaac for the first time since the alley. The warehouse was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft sound of Isaac's breathing. Daniel approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Isaac's head came up slightly, and their eyes met in the dim light filtering through the windows. The recognition was stronger now, clearer, and Daniel saw something he hadn't dared to hope for. Trust. He pulled the medicine bottle from his pocket and held it out, letting Isaac smell the water inside. The horse's nostrils flared, and after a moment of consideration, he accepted the offering, drinking the small amount gratefully. "I know it's not much," Daniel said quietly, refilling the bottle from a nearby faucet. "But it's clean, and it's given with love. That has to count for something." Martha had said something similar during her final hospital stay, when Daniel had brought her ice chips made from well water instead of the industrial ice the hospital provided. "It tastes like home," she'd whispered. And Daniel had understood that sometimes the source mattered as much as the substance. Now, watching Isaac drink from Martha's medicine bottle, Daniel felt the first stirring of something he'd thought was lost forever hope. Isaac was broken, perhaps beyond complete repair, but he was alive. He was here, in this unlikely place, accepting care from the man who had failed him. It wasn't redemption. That would require much more than a warehouse and a bottle of water. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, Daniel had learned, were sometimes the most precious gifts of all. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime rhythm, a symphony of sirens and car horns and human voices raised in a dozen different languages. Inside the warehouse, a man and his horse began the long journey back towards something that might, with time and grace, become forgiveness. The wedding quilt had taken Martha 3 years to complete, each tiny stitch placed with the patience that came naturally to Amish women. Daniel had watched her work on it during winter evenings, her fingers moving steadily by lamplight while he read aloud from the budget or the Bible. The pattern was wedding ring, traditional and complex, with interlocking circles in shades of blue and cream that seemed to dance together in the right light. Now, as Daniel spread the precious quilt over Isaac's back in the dim warehouse, he wondered what Martha would think of his choice. The quilt was worth hundreds of dollars in the tourist markets, more in sentimental value. It was meant to be passed down to children, to warm future generations on cold Pennsylvania nights. Instead, it was covering a sick horse in an abandoned building in Philadelphia. But Martha had loved Isaac too, in her quiet way. She'd never said much about it, but Daniel had seen her slip extra carrots to the horse when she thought no one was looking, and watched her braid wildflowers into his mane during the spring festivals. She'd understood, perhaps better than Daniel himself, that some bonds transcended practical considerations. "If this helps him heal," Daniel murmured, adjusting the quilt around Isaac's shoulders, "then it's being used exactly as you intended." Isaac stood more steadily this morning, his 3rd day in the warehouse. The trembling in his legs had lessened, and his breathing had grown deeper, more regular. Daniel had established routines: water every hour, small portions of soaked oats every 3 hours, gentle grooming with a borrowed brush. The horse accepted it all with patient dignity, as if he understood that survival required cooperation. The phone calls had started on the 2nd day. "Daniel Miller, where in the Lord's name are you?" Bishop Yoder's voice had crackled through the cheap cell phone Hoare had insisted Daniel buy. "Samuel Byler says he saw you getting on a bus to Philadelphia. You missed worship service, and your neighbors are asking questions." Daniel had explained about the medical supplies for Heinrich Mueller, about the bus breakdown that had stranded him in the city. He hadn't mentioned Isaac, not yet. That conversation would require face-to-face honesty, not the scratchy inadequacy of a phone connection. "The city is no place for our people," the bishop had continued. "Come home, Daniel. Whatever business you have there can wait." But it couldn't wait. Each day brought small improvements in Isaac's condition, signs that the horse's remarkable constitution was responding to consistent care. His eyes were brighter, his coat was beginning to show hints of its former luster, and yesterday he'd actually whinnied a weak sound, but recognizably, Isaac's voice. The warehouse had become its own small world, separate from both the Amish community Daniel had left and the city that sprawled beyond its walls. Jorge and Carlos visited daily, bringing supplies and offering practical assistance. Maria had recruited her teenage daughter Elena to help with Isaac's care, and the girl had proven surprisingly knowledgeable about horses. "My grandmother had a farm in Puerto Rico," Elena had explained while brushing Isaac's mane with practiced strokes. "She taught me that horses remember kindness longer than they remember cruelty. This one, he remembers you loved him." It was Elena who first noticed Isaac's improved appetite, who suggested supplementing his feed with apple cider vinegar to aid digestion, who pointed out that his coat was growing thicker despite the spring warmth. She visited after school each day, her Spanish-accented English mixing easily with Daniel's Pennsylvania Dutch when words failed them both. The unlikely partnership worked. Alana's youthful energy complemented Daniel's methodical patience, and Isaac responded to both. He would nick her softly when Elena arrived with her backpack full of homework and horse treats, and he would rest his massive head against Daniel's chest during their quiet evening grooming sessions. But success brought its own complications. "You can't keep living in a warehouse," Lori had said on the fourth morning, finding Daniel asleep on a pile of horse blankets near Isaac's improvised stall. "Your back will never forgive you, and the city inspectors will eventually come around, asking questions." Daniel had considered returning to the farm each night, making the 2-hour drive to maintain appearances while Isaac recovered. But the horse's trust was still fragile, still rebuilding from the trauma of abandonment. Leaving him alone, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of the healing they'd begun together. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rebecca Chun arrived on Thursday afternoon, her small Asian features set in professional lines as she surveyed the makeshift equine hospital Daniel had created. She was a veterinarian specializing in large animals, Laura's cousin had explained, someone who might be willing to examine Isaac without involving official authorities. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Chan had said after completing her examination. "I could lose my license treating animals in an unlicensed facility." Daniel had watched her work with growing respect. Her hands were gentle but thorough, her questions precise and informed. Isaac had stood calmly for the examination, as if he recognized competent medical care when he received it. "But," Dr. Chun had continued, making notes in a small leather journal, "this horse has been through significant trauma, and his recovery so far has been remarkable. Sometimes irregular situations call for irregular solutions." Her diagnosis had been cautiously optimistic. Isaac was severely malnourished and would carry the effects of his neglect for the rest of his life, but his basic health was stabilizing. With continued care and proper nutrition, he could potentially return to light work, not the heavy labor of his prime years, but enough to give his life purpose and dignity. "He'll need at least 6 more weeks of intensive care," Dr. Chun had warned, "and even then, he'll never be the horse he was before. 6 more weeks in the city. 6 more weeks away from his farm, his community, his normal life." Daniel had nodded acceptance without hesitation. That evening, as Isaac dozed under Martha's wedding quilt and the warehouse filled with shadows, Daniel had made his first real phone call home. "Abraham?" His son's voice had been sharp with worry. When he answered, "Where are you?" "Bishop Yoder says you've been gone for days." Daniel had taken a deep breath and told the truth, all of it. Isaac's sale, the hospital's refund check, the discovery in the alley, the warehouse, the decision to stay until Isaac recovered. Abraham had listened without interruption, a trait he'd inherited from his mother. "You should have called me when the medical bills got too high," Abraham had said finally. "I would have helped. You didn't need to sell Isaac." "A man provides for his own family," Daniel had replied, the old words feeling hollow now. Isaac was family too, wasn't he? The question had hung in the air between them, unanswerable and utterly true. Isaac had been family, not in the human sense, but in the way that mattered most. He'd been constant, loyal, present for every important moment in Daniel's adult life. And Daniel had sold him to pay for treatments that hadn't saved Martha anyway. Yes, Daniel had admitted. He was. "Then you're doing the right thing," Abraham had said quietly. "Mother would be proud." Now, watching Isaac sleep peacefully under the quilt Martha had made with her own hands, Daniel allowed himself to believe that might be true. The healing happening in this unlikely place wasn't just physical, it was deeper than that, touching wounds that had festered in silence for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more phone calls from concerned community members, more complicated explanations about choices that couldn't be easily justified. But tonight, a man and his horse were together again, sheltered by love that had been tested, but not broken dodd. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The hand-carved wooden cross had been with Daniel since childhood, whittled by his father during long winter evenings when field work gave way to indoor crafts. It was simple, unadorned, barely 3 inches tall, but it carried the weight of generations. His father had carried it, and his grandfather before him, through wars and harvests, births and deaths, times of plenty and seasons of want. Now, sitting in the warehouse office while Isaac dozed below, Daniel turned the cross over in his calloused fingers and wondered what his ancestors would think of his current situation. The Amish believed in accepting God's will without question, in community over individual desire, in the wisdom of elders over the impulses of personal conscience. Everything Daniel was doing here violated those principles. The phone rang again. It had been ringing all morning, the cheap device Jorge had given him buzzing against the metal desk like an angry wasp. Each call brought new pressure to return home, new questions about his extended absence, new reminders of the responsibilities he was neglecting. This time, the caller ID showed Bishop Yoder's number, Daniel Miller. The bishop's voice carried the authority of decades of spiritual leadership. "I'm coming to Philadelphia tomorrow. We need to speak face-to-face about this situation." Daniel's stomach tightened. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable but hoping for more time to prepare. "Bishop, I can explain." "No explanations over the phone," Yoder interrupted. "Where are you staying?" "I'll bring Samuel Byler and we'll discuss this properly." The thought of the bishop and Samuel Byler, one of the community's most conservative members, seeing Isaac in the warehouse made Daniel's mouth go dry. They would see only an old horse that should have been left to God's will, not the living symbol of broken promises and restored faith that Isaac had become. "I'll meet you at the bus station," Daniel said quickly. "Tomorrow afternoon when you arrive." "No, Daniel. We'll come to where you're staying." A man's circumstances tell us much about his state of mind. After the bishop hung up, Daniel sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the city's nighttime symphony through the warehouse windows. Below, Isaac stirred in his makeshift stall. No longer the skeletal figure Daniel had found in the alley, but not yet the magnificent animal he'd once been. The horse was existing in that uncertain space between recovery and health, just as Daniel was existing between his old life and whatever came next. Elena arrived for her evening visit, backpack slung over one shoulder and a paper bag in her hand. She'd been coming every day for a week now, her youthful enthusiasm a bright counterpoint to Daniel's growing anxiety about the future. "How is he today?" she asked, dropping her bag near the office stairs and pulling an apple from her pocket. "Stronger," Daniel replied, following her down to Isaac's corner of the warehouse. "Dr. Chun thinks he's gained almost 100 pounds since we found him." It was true. Isaac's ribs no longer showed through his skin, and his coat had regained much of its former luster. His eyes were bright and alert, and he'd begun to show interest in his surroundings beyond the immediate necessities of food and water. Yesterday, he'd actually attempted to play with a piece of rope Elena had brought, something Daniel hadn't seen him do in years. "He remembers how to be happy," Elena said, offering Isaac the apple with practiced ease. "My grandmother used to say that animals heal faster than people because they don't carry guilt about the past." Daniel watched Isaac crunch the apple with obvious pleasure and wondered if Elena's grandmother had been right. The horse seemed to harbor no resentment about his months of suffering, no anger about being sold and abandoned. He simply existed, in the present moment, accepting care when it was offered and giving trust in return. "What about people?" Daniel asked. "What did your grandmother say about people carrying guilt?" Elena was quiet for a moment, running her hand along Isaac's neck while she considered the question. She said that guilt was like a stone in your pocket. You can carry it forever if you want to, but eventually you have to decide whether the weight is helping you remember something important or just making it harder to walk. The wisdom of children, Daniel thought, delivered with the casual certainty that only came from innocence. Elena had no idea how perfectly her words described his current struggle, how accurately she'd captured the choice he'd been avoiding for months. "My church leader is coming tomorrow," Daniel said. "He wants me to return home. Will you go?" Daniel looked at Isaac, who had finished his apple and was now resting his massive head against Elena's shoulder. The trust implicit in that gesture, a 1,000-pound animal leaning on a 90-pound girl, spoke volumes about the capacity for forgiveness that humans seem to struggle with. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I made a promise to someone very important to me, and I broke it. Being here with Isaac, helping him heal it, feels like the first right thing I've done in months. But my community needs me too. They have expectations, responsibilities that I've been neglecting." Elena was quiet for several minutes, continuing her gentle grooming of Isaac's mane. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a maturity that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 15 years. "My mother brought us here from Puerto Rico when I was 8, she said. "We left everything, family, friends, the only home I'd ever known. I was angry for a long time, especially when kids at school made fun of my accent or my clothes. I wanted to go back, to return to what felt safe and familiar." She paused, her fingers working carefully through a tangle in Isaac's forelock. "But you know what I learned? Sometimes you can't go back to who you were before, even when you want to. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is accept who you've become and figure out how to be that person in the world as it is, not as it was." Daniel felt the wooden cross warm in his palm as he considered Elena's words. His father had carved it during a time of great change in their community, when the outside world was pressing in and traditional ways were being challenged. The cross had been a reminder that faith could endure even when everything else was shifting. Maybe that was what Daniel needed now, not a return to the way things had been, but faith that God could work through the mess he'd made of his life. Faith that the love driving him to care for Isaac was itself a form of prayer, even if his community couldn't understand it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Philadelphia weather that made the warehouse feel more like a cave than a shelter. Daniel had barely slept, his mind churning through possible conversations with Bishop Yoder, each scenario ending with uncomfortable ultimatums about loyalty and duty. Isaac seemed to sense Daniel's agitation, staying closer than usual during morning care routines. When Daniel sat on a feed bucket to rest his aching back, Isaac moved to stand beside him, his warm bulk a comforting presence in the echoing space. "You know something's wrong, don't you?" Daniel murmured, running his hand along Isaac's neck. "You always could read people better than most people can read people." Jorge arrived with supplies and news that made Daniel's anxiety spike even higher. "There's been talk in the neighborhood," Jorge said, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "Some people are asking questions about the horse, about why he's here so long. My cousin Carlos is getting nervous about the attention." The implication was clear. The warehouse arrangement had always been temporary, dependent on the goodwill of people who were taking risks to help a stranger. If that goodwill was being strained by community pressure or official scrutiny, Daniel's options were narrowing rapidly. "How much time do we have?" Daniel asked. Jorge shrugged, his expression apologetic. "Maybe a week, maybe 2. Carlos likes you, and he can see how much better the horse is doing. But he's got his own problems to worry about." Daniel nodded, understanding the position Jorge's family was in. They'd already done more than anyone could reasonably expect, providing shelter and support to a man and horse they barely knew. It was time to find a more permanent solution, even if that solution meant difficult choices about Isaac's future. When Bishop Yoder and Samuel Byler arrived that afternoon, their reaction to the warehouse was exactly what Daniel had feared. They stood in the doorway, like men surveying a battlefield, their disapproval evident in every line of their posture. "So this is where you've been," Samuel said, his voice heavy with judgment. "Living among the English, caring for an animal that should have been left to God's will." But Bishop Yoder's reaction was more complex. He approached Isaac's stall slowly, studying the horse with the careful attention of a man who'd spent his life around farm animals. Isaac, for his part, remained calm but alert, accepting the bishop's presence without the nervousness that strangers usually provoked. "He looks well," the bishop said finally. "Better than he did before you sold him, if I'm being honest." The admission surprised everyone, including Samuel, who clearly expected unified condemnation of Daniel's choices. Daniel felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the conversation wouldn't end with the ultimatum he'd been dreading. "Bishop," Daniel began, "I know this looks wrong from the outside. I know I've neglected my responsibilities to the community. But Isaac was dying when I found him. The man I sold him to was a fraud, a criminal who worked him until he collapsed and then abandoned him in an alley." He explained about Henderson's deception, about the network of fraud that had targeted their community specifically, about the federal investigation that was building around Isaac's case. As he spoke, he watched both men's expressions shift from disapproval to concern to anger, not at Daniel, but at the criminals who'd exploited their trust. "3 other families from our district," Bishop Yoder said grimly when Daniel finished. "We've been trying to locate their animals for weeks." The knowledge that other families had suffered similar losses seemed to reframe Daniel's actions in the bishop's mind. This wasn't just about one man's sentimental attachment to a horse. It was about protecting their community from predators who specifically targeted their trusting nature. "What do you plan to do now?" the bishop asked. "You can't stay here indefinitely. And bringing the horse home raises questions about your judgment that I'm not sure the community is ready to address." It was the question Daniel had been avoiding, the choice he'd been dreading. Isaac was healing, but he wasn't healed. The horse needed continued care, continued consistency, continued proof that not all humans would abandon him when circumstances became difficult. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I only know that I made a promise to Martha, and I broke it once. I won't break it again." The wooden cross seemed to pulse with warmth in his pocket as he spoke the words, as if approving of the decision that was crystallizing in his mind. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would not abandon Isaac again. The conversation that followed was difficult, but not impossible. Bishop Yoder was a practical man who understood that communities survived by adapting to challenges, rather than simply resisting them. If Daniel's actions could help protect other families from similar frauds, then perhaps his time in the city served a purpose beyond personal redemption. "Come home," the bishop said finally. "Bring the horse. If you must, we'll find a way to make it work." The horseshoe was small and worn, barely the size of Daniel's palm, forged when Isaac was just a yearling, and his hooves were still growing into their adult size. Daniel had saved it after Isaac's first shoeing, though he couldn't say exactly why. Martha had found it years later while cleaning out the barn and had smiled at the sentiment, saying nothing but placing it carefully on a shelf where Daniel could see it every day. Now, holding that first horseshoe in the warehouse office, while Bishop Yoder's footsteps echoed in the stairwell below, Daniel understood why he'd kept it. It represented the beginning of their partnership, the moment when Isaac had transformed from a promising young horse into Daniel's trusted companion. Every journey began with a single step, and this worn piece of iron had protected Isaac's first steps into the life they'd built together. "Daniel Miller," Bishop Yoder's voice carried up from the warehouse floor formal and disapproving. "What is the meaning of this?" Daniel tucked the horseshoe into his coat pocket and descended the stairs to face the consequences of his choices. The bishop stood in the center of the warehouse, his black coat and wide-brimmed hat making him seem like a figure from another century amid the industrial setting. Samuel Byler flanked him, his weathered face set in lines of obvious disapproval. But it was their reaction to Isaac that revealed the true nature of the confrontation to come. "So," Bishop Yoder said quietly, his eyes taking in Isaac's improved condition, the careful arrangement of his care area, the obvious investment of time and resources. "You found him." The words carried layers of meaning Daniel wasn't sure how to interpret. Did the bishop already know about Isaac's suffering? Had word of Carl Henderson's fraudulent operation reached the Amish community? Or was this simply the acknowledgement of a situation that had become impossible to ignore? "He was dying," Daniel said simply. "I couldn't leave him." Samuel Byler stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "You've been gone for over a week, Daniel Miller. Your farm sits untended. Your neighbors worry about your state of mind. And you've been living like an Englisher in the city, all for a horse you sold months ago." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Daniel had neglected his responsibilities, had chosen Isaac's needs over his community's expectations, had indeed been living among the English, with their strange ways and loud voices. But he'd also kept a promise that should never have been broken in the first place. "Isaac was betrayed by the man I sold him to," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his chest. "He was worked until he collapsed, then abandoned in an alley to die. I couldn't walk away from that. And what of your obligations to the living?" Samuel pressed. "Heinrich Müller needed his insulin supplies a week ago. Your neighbor's fence was damaged in the storm, and he expected your help repairing it. The spring planting waits for no man's sentimental attachments to animals." Each point was valid, each criticism justified. Daniel had indeed placed Isaac's needs above his community responsibilities, had chosen the dramatic gesture over the quiet faithfulness that defined Amish life. But as he looked at Isaac standing alert and dignified in his makeshift stall, his coat gleaming under the warehouse lights, Daniel couldn't bring himself to regret that choice. "Bishop." Yoder had remained silent during Samuel's catalog of Daniel's failures, his eyes moving between Daniel and Isaac with an expression that was difficult to read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Tell me about the man who bought Isaac," the bishop said. Daniel described Carl Henderson, the promises made and broken, the discovery of the broader fraud that had victimized multiple Amish families. As he spoke, he watched both men's faces carefully, seeing their anger grow not at Daniel, but at the man who had preyed on their community's trust. "3 other families from our district," Samuel said grimly. "The Hospitalers lost their draft team, the Millers their dairy cow, and young Jacob Stoltz sold his buggy horse to pay for his mother's surgery. All to the same man, all with the same promises of good care." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. He wasn't the only one who'd been deceived, wasn't the only family that had suffered from Henderson's cruelty. But he was apparently the only one who'd found his animal and been able to do something about it. "Where are the others?" Daniel asked. "The Hospitalers' horses? The Miller's cow?" Bishop Yoder's expression darkened. "We don't know. Henderson's farm was abandoned when the authorities arrived. Some animals were found in poor condition. Others were gone entirely. Sold to slaughterhouses, most likely." The weight of that knowledge settled over Daniel like a shroud. Isaac's recovery was a miracle, but it was also an accident of timing and geography. If Daniel hadn't been in Philadelphia that day, if he hadn't taken that particular street, Isaac would have died in that alley just as surely as the other animals had died in ways they would never know. "So you see," Bishop Yoder continued. This isn't simply about one man's attachment to his horse. This is about our community's vulnerability to those who would exploit our trust, our reluctance to ask hard questions when we're desperate for solutions. Elena's daily arrival interrupted the heavy conversation. She bounded up the warehouse steps with her usual energy, then stopped short when she saw the three Amish men standing in serious conference near Isaac's stall. Her natural teenage confidence faltered in the face of such adult solemnity. "I'm sorry," she said, backing toward the door. "I didn't know you had visitors." "Wait," Daniel called. "Elena, these are men from my community. Bishop Yoder Samuel. Byler, this is Elena Santos. She's been helping me care for Isaac." Elena approached cautiously, clearly uncertain about the proper way to interact with the Amish elders. But Isaac solved the social dilemma by nickering softly at her approach, his obvious pleasure at seeing her breaking the tension in the warehouse. "He knows your voice," Bishop Yoder observed, watching Isaac's animated response to Elena's presence. "We've become friends," Elena said simply, pulling an apple from her backpack and offering it to Isaac. "He's a very gentle horse, very intelligent. Senator Miller has been taking excellent care of him." Daniel watched the bishop observe Elena's easy interaction with Isaac, saw him note the horse's improved condition, the careful organization of the care area, the obvious investment of time and expertise that had gone into Isaac's recovery. When Elena began brushing Isaac's mane while chattering about her day at school, the bishop's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "How much longer will he need this intensive care?" Bishop Yoder asked. "Dr. Chun thinks another 3 weeks," Daniel replied. "Maybe 4. He's made remarkable progress, but the damage from those months of neglect runs deep." The bishop nodded slowly, his eyes still on Elena and Isaac. And then? It was the question Daniel had been avoiding, the choice he'd been dreading. Isaac was healing, but he would never be the horse he'd been before. He could return to light work, perhaps, but not the heavy labor that had defined his purpose for 15 years. What place was there for a semi-retired horse on a working Amish farm? "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Perhaps," Bishop Yoder said quietly. "It's time you did." As the afternoon wore on and the difficult conversations continued, Daniel found himself reaching repeatedly for the horseshoe in his pocket. The small piece of iron had protected Isaac's first steps into their shared life, had marked the beginning of a partnership that had endured for 15 years. Now, as that partnership faced an uncertain future, the horseshoe reminded Daniel that every ending was also a beginning. Every choice the first step of a new journey. The question was whether he had the courage to take that step, and where it might lead him. The legal document that changed everything was yellowed with age and folded into quarters, hidden in the depths of Daniel's old leather wallet behind outdated farm receipts and a photo of Martha on their wedding day. He'd forgotten it was there, until Jorge's cousin Carlos mentioned needing the original bill of sale to satisfy the city inspector, who'd finally come asking questions about the warehouse's unusual occupant. "It's just a formality," Carlos had assured him. "Show them you legally own the horse and they'll leave us alone." Daniel had pulled out his wallet reluctantly, knowing that any documentation would raise more questions than it answered. But as he unfolded the creased paper Carl Henderson had given him 4 months ago, his eyes caught details he'd been too emotionally compromised to notice at the time of sale. The letterhead was wrong. The bill of sale claimed to be from Henderson Family Farm, Est, 1987, Reading, PA. But the address listed was a post office box, not a farm location. More damning still, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture licensing number at the bottom of the document was a string of digits that, even to Daniel's untrained eye, looked suspiciously irregular. "Oh, here," Daniel called, his voice tight with a growing suspicion. "Can you look at this?" Jorge studied the document with the careful attention of a man who dealt with official paperwork in multiple languages and 2 countries. His frown deepened as he examined the various stamps and signatures that had seemed legitimate to Daniel's trusting eyes. "This is fake," Jorge said flatly. "The state seal is wrong. The registration numbers don't follow the right format. And look here." He pointed to Henderson's signature. "The ink is different colors." He signed this with whatever pen was handy, not the official documents of a licensed livestock dealer. The implications hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. If the bill of sale was fraudulent, then Henderson had never been a legitimate horse dealer at all. The entire transaction had been illegal from the start, which meant Isaac was stolen, Daniel whispered, the words carrying a weight that seemed to press the air from his lungs. Henderson never had the right to buy him in the first place. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Jorge spread the document on the warehouse's makeshift desk and examined it more closely, an even more disturbing pattern emerged. These numbers. "Here," Jorge said, pointing to a series of digits in the corner of the page. "They're not registration numbers. They look like lot numbers, the kind used by—" He stopped, his face paling as the realization struck him. "Used by what?" Daniel pressed. "Slaughterhouses," Jorge finished quietly. "These are the lot tracking numbers used by meat processing facilities." The warehouse seemed to spin around Daniel as the full scope of Henderson's operation became clear. The man hadn't been running a legitimate horse business at all. He'd been buying animals from trusting families, working them until they were worthless, then selling them for slaughter. The abandoned farm, the missing animals, the carefully constructed lies about retirement homes and loving families. It had all been part of an elaborate system to exploit both animals and the people who loved them. Isaac had been bought to die. The knowledge struck Daniel with such force that he had to sit down, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. All those months of guilt about selling Isaac, all the self-recrimination about choosing money over loyalty, and the truth was that Henderson had been planning to kill Isaac from the moment he loaded him into the trailer. "We have to call the police," Jorge said, reaching for his phone. "This is evidence of fraud, animal cruelty, probably a dozen other crimes." But Daniel's mind was racing beyond the immediate crime to its broader implications. If Henderson had been running this operation for years, targeting Amish families specifically because of their trusting nature and reluctance to involve law enforcement, then how many animals had suffered? How many families had unknowingly sent beloved companions to their deaths? And more immediately, if Isaac legally belonged to a slaughterhouse somewhere, what would happen when the authorities got involved? "Wait," Daniel said, placing a hand on Jorge's arm. "Before we call anyone, I need to understand what this means for Isaac. If he was supposed to be processed for meat, if there are legal claims on him, ... Jorge's expression grew grim. "I don't know, hermano, but I think we need to find out before we involve the government." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and online research. Elena arrived for her evening visit to find Daniel hunched over Carlos's laptop, trying to navigate websites that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The legal complexities of livestock ownership, fraud prosecution, and asset recovery were far beyond his rural education. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, immediately picking up on the tension that filled the warehouse like smoke. Daniel explained about the fraudulent bill of sale, about Henderson's true business model, about the possibility that Isaac might legally belong to some distant corporation that dealt in meat rather than living animals. Elena listened with growing horror, her hand resting protectively on Isaac's neck, as if she could shield him from bureaucratic complications through simple touch. "But he's alive," she said when Daniel finished. "He's here. He's healthy. He knows. You love him. How can some piece of paper change that?" It was the innocent question of youth, the assumption that love and justice would naturally align to protect the innocent. Daniel envied her that certainty, even as he feared she was about to learn that the world was more complicated than such simple moral equations. Suggested. Dr. Chun arrived that evening with news that complicated the situation further. She'd been contacted by the State Veterinary Board about Henderson's operation, asked to provide information about any animals she'd treated that might be connected to the case. There are federal agencies involved now, she explained, her professional demeanor unable to hide her personal concern. Agricultural fraud, animal cruelty, racketeering. This is much bigger than anyone initially realized. Henderson was part of a network that's been operating across 3 states. Daniel felt the walls of the warehouse pressing in around him as the scope of the investigation became clear. Isaac had recovered his health, but he was about to become evidence in a federal case. The horse might be confiscated, held in government facilities, while lawyers and bureaucrats determined his legal status. After everything they'd been through, Isaac might end up in another form of captivity, legal this time, but no less devastating. What happens to Isaac? Daniel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Dr. Chun was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from Daniel to Isaac and back again. I don't know, she admitted. The legal precedents are unclear when stolen property has been significantly improved through the care of an innocent third party. You've invested time and money in Isaac's recovery, but technically, you never owned him legally. The irony was bitter enough to taste. Daniel had sold Isaac to pay Martha's medical bills, had agonized over breaking his promise to care for the horse, had found and nursed him back to health at tremendous personal cost, and now he might lose Isaac anyway, not through his own choices, but through the machinations of a criminal he'd never suspected existed. There might be options, Dr. Chun continued carefully. Legal avenues for people in your situation. But it would require going public with the case, testifying about Henderson's fraud, becoming part of a federal prosecution that could take years to resolve. Daniel looked at Isaac, who was peacefully eating his evening oats while Elena brushed his coat to its evening shine. The horse had no idea that his fate was being decided by laws and regulations he could never understand. He simply existed in the moment, trusting that the humans around him would continue to provide care and protection. That trust, Daniel realized, was what this had always been about. Not ownership or legal rights or even the promises made to the dying, but the simple faith that love would find a way to protect what mattered most. I'll do whatever it takes, Daniel said quietly. Isaac has suffered enough. If there's a legal way to keep him safe, I'll take it. Outside, the city night pressed against the warehouse windows, full of sirens and distant voices and the constant hum of a world that never slept. Inside, a man prepared to fight a system he'd never understood to protect a horse that had already taught him more about courage than 40 years of sermons ever had. The battle for Isaac's future was about to begin, and Daniel Miller Quiet, Amish farmer, widower, man of simple faith, was about to discover that sometimes love required not just sacrifice, but the willingness to step outside everything you'd ever known to fight for what was right. Martha's Bible was worn soft at the edges, its leather cover marked by decades of daily reading and the oils from countless hands that had turned its pages seeking comfort, guidance, or simply the familiar rhythm of sacred words. Daniel had given it to her as a wedding gift, and she'd read from it every morning and evening until the cancer made even holding the book too exhausting. Now, sitting in the warehouse office at 3 a.m, while Isaac slept peacefully below, Daniel opened the Bible to passages Martha had marked with careful pencil notes in the margins. Her handwriting was precise, economical, the words of a woman who'd learned to make every mark count. Faith requires action, she'd written beside James 2:17. Dead faith helps no one. Sometimes the right path is the difficult path, appeared. Next to Matthew 7:14, and beside Proverbs 3-5. In Martha's careful script, trust in the Lord's plan, even when we can't see where it leads. Daniel traced the words with his finger, feeling the slight indentations her pencil had left in the paper. Tomorrow today, really, since dawn was only hours away, would bring the most important confrontation of his life. The federal prosecutors wanted his testimony about Henderson's fraud. The State Veterinary Board needed his cooperation in building their case. And most importantly, a judge would decide whether Isaac could remain in Daniel's care or would become a ward of the court. Until the legal proceedings concluded, it had taken 2 weeks to reach this point. 2 weeks of lawyers and depositions, of government investigators tramping through the warehouse, asking questions about every detail of Isaac's care and recovery. 2 weeks of phone calls to and from the Amish community as Bishop Yoder worked with church lawyers to understand how Daniel's situation might affect other families who'd been victimized by Henderson's network. The scope of the criminal operation had grown with each day's revelations. Henderson hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a network that stretched across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, specifically targeting Amish and Mennonite communities, whose members were known for their trusting nature and reluctance to involve law enforcement. Dozens of families had been victimized, hundreds of animals had suffered, and the financial losses totaled in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Daniel's discovery of Isaac had been the first break in a case that federal agents had been building for months without knowing it. The fraudulent bill of sale was the key piece of evidence that exposed the network's document forgery operation. Isaac himself was living proof that the criminals' claims about animal welfare were lies. But being important to the prosecution didn't guarantee Isaac's safety. Government lawyers had made it clear that the horse might need to remain in federal custody as evidence, housed in facilities that specialized in holding confiscated livestock. The conditions would be adequate, they assured Daniel, but bureaucratic. Necessity would take precedence over the individual relationships that had made Isaac's recovery possible. Dr. Chun had testified on Isaac's behalf, explaining the specialized care that had saved his life and emphasizing that removing him from Daniel's custody could trigger a psychological setback that might prove fatal. Elena had written a letter to the judge, her teenage passion translating into surprisingly eloquent advocacy for keeping Isaac with the man who'd risked everything to save him. Even Bishop Yoder had gotten involved, though his support came with conditions that kept Daniel awake most nights. "If you are going to see this through," the bishop had said during his last visit to the warehouse, "then you must do it as an Amish man, not as some individual pursuing personal justice. Our community's reputation is at stake now. How you conduct yourself reflects on all of us." The pressure was enormous. Every choice Daniel made would be scrutinized not just by federal prosecutors and defense attorneys, but by his own community and its centuries-old traditions of non-resistance and separation from worldly concerns. He was supposed to be a witness to Amish values while simultaneously fighting a legal battle that required engagement with systems the Amish traditionally avoided, or his family had become unofficial advisors in navigating the complex cultural requirements. Maria's husband Carlos worked in construction and had experience dealing with government inspectors and bureaucrats. Elena had researched equine law on the internet, printing out cases where private individuals had successfully fought for custody of rescued animals. Even Har's elderly mother had contributed, bringing traditional Puerto Rican remedies that she claimed would strengthen Isaac for the ordeal ahead. The legal strategy was straightforward but risky. Daniel's lawyer, a young woman named Patricia Reeves, who specialized in agricultural law, would argue that Isaac had been abandoned by his legal owners when Henderson dumped him in the alley to die. Under Pennsylvania's abandonment statutes, Daniel had acquired legitimate ownership through rescue and extensive rehabilitation. The fraudulent bill of sale, rather than invalidating Daniel's claim, actually strengthened it by proving that Henderson had never been Isaac's legitimate owner in the first place. That it was a good argument, Patricia had assured him, but success would depend on the judge's interpretation of complex regulations that had never been applied to a case quite like this one. The outcome could go either way. "Are you prepared for the possibility that we might lose?" Patricia had asked during their final preparation session. The court might decide that Isaac needs to remain in federal custody, regardless of the legal technicalities. Daniel had considered the question seriously. Losing Isaac again, this time to bureaucratic necessity rather than personal failure, would be devastating. But the alternative, not fighting at all, accepting that love and loyalty meant nothing when weighed against legal complications, was unthinkable. "I'm prepared to try," he'd answered. "Whatever happens, I want Isaac to know that someone fought for him." Now, reading Martha's notes in the quiet hours before dawn, Daniel found himself thinking about different kinds of preparation. Martha had faced her own impossible battle, fighting cancer with the same quiet determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. She'd lost that fight, but she'd faced it with dignity and faith that had inspired everyone around her. Maybe that was what preparation really meant, not guaranteeing victory, but ensuring that you could face defeat with honor intact. Isaac stirred in his stall below, and Daniel could hear the gentle sounds of the horse shifting position, perhaps sensing the tension that filled the warehouse like electricity before a storm. Daniel closed the Bible and made his way downstairs, drawn by the need to check on his friend one more time before the day that would determine their future together. Isaac was awake, standing alert in his makeshift stall, with his ears pricked forward in Daniel's direction. The horse looked magnificent, his coat gleaming even in the dim warehouse lighting, his eyes bright with intelligence and recognition. It was hard to believe this was the same broken animal Daniel had found dying in an alley 6 weeks ago. "Hello, old friend," Daniel said softly, approaching with the familiar ritual of offering his hand for Isaac to smell before touching. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Isaac nuzzled Daniel's palm, then rested his massive head against Daniel's chest in a gesture that had become their evening routine. The weight was comforting, solid and warm, and undeniably alive. Whatever happened in court, this moment was real. This bond was real. The healing they'd accomplished together was real. Elena arrived earlier than usual, slipping into the warehouse just as the first hints of gray light began to filter through the high windows. She'd obviously dressed carefully for court, a simple blue dress instead of her usual jeans and t-shirt, her long hair braided back neatly. "How are you feeling?" she asked, joining Daniel beside Isaac's stall. "Nervous," Daniel admitted. "But ready, I think." Elena nodded, running her hand along Isaac's neck with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours earning his trust. "My grandmother always said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid." "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She would have liked Isaac," Elena said. "She always said you could judge people by how they treated animals when no one was watching." Dr. Chun arrived as the warehouse filled with morning light, carrying her medical bag and a thick folder of documentation about Isaac's treatment and recovery. She'd been up most of the night, she explained, preparing detailed records that would demonstrate the specialized care Isaac required and the progress he'd made under Daniel's custody. "Whatever happens today," she said, checking Isaac's vital signs one last time, "this horse owes his life to what you've done here. That's not something any judge can take away." Jorge and Carlos arrived with the horse trailer that would transport Isaac to the courthouse. The plan was to bring Isaac to the proceeding, to let the judge see firsthand the results of Daniel's care and the bond between man and horse. It was Patricia's idea, a calculated risk that could either strengthen their case or backfire if Isaac showed stress in the unfamiliar environment. But as they loaded Isaac into the trailer, The same one that had carried him from the alley to the warehouse 6 weeks ago. The horse remained calm and trusting. He'd learned to associate the trailer with safety, with the beginning of his journey back to health and dignity. The community meeting bell was bronze, cast in 1847 by the same foundry that had made church bells for half the counties in Pennsylvania. It hung in the courthouse square, a relic from the days when official business was announced by the clear, resonant tone that could carry for miles across farmland. Today, as Daniel Miller stood on the courthouse steps with Isaac beside him, that bell seemed to watch over proceedings that would have been unimaginable to the German immigrants who'd first heard its call to gather. Judge Margaret Sullivan was younger than Daniel had expected, perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that suggested she'd heard every story human nature could devise. Her courtroom was modern but traditional, wood-paneled and serious, designed to remind everyone present that justice was weighty business. Isaac stood quietly beside Daniel's chair, his presence causing a stir among the court personnel who'd clearly never seen a Clydesdale used as evidence. Dr. Chun had sedated him lightly for the transport, but the horse remained alert and responsive, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with calm interest. "This is highly irregular," Judge Sullivan observed, studying Isaac with the attention of someone who appreciated the unusual aspects of the case before her. "But given the unique circumstances, I'll allow the animal to remain in the courtroom as long as he doesn't become disruptive." The federal prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named David Richardson, opened with a presentation that laid out the scope of Henderson's criminal network. Charts and photographs filled easel stands around the courtroom, images of malnourished animals, forged documents, bank records showing the flow of money from trusting families to criminal enterprises. Carl Henderson and his associates targeted Amish and Mennonite communities specifically, Richardson explained, pointing to a map dotted with red pins showing the locations of victimized families. They exploited these communities' trusting nature and reluctance to involve law enforcement, creating a systematic fraud that operated for over 3 years. Daniel listened to the clinical recitation of crimes he'd experienced personally, feeling the weight of his community's vulnerability laid bare in legal terminology. Every red pin on the prosecutor's map represented a family like his people, who'd made desperate choices based on trust that had been weaponized against them. "The defendant's bill of sale," Richardson continued, holding up the document that had started Daniel's journey, "is a masterpiece of deception. Forged letterhead, false licensing numbers, fraudulent signatures, every element designed to appear legitimate to people who had no reason to suspect criminal intent." Patricia Reeves, Daniel's attorney, rose for her response with quiet confidence. She was 35, Daniel had learned, a farm girl from Chester County who'd gone to law school specifically to help rural families navigate legal complexities. Her opening statement was personal in a way that made the federal prosecutor's presentation seem coldly bureaucratic. "Your Honor," Patricia began, "this case is about more than fraud and forgery. It's about what happens when love refuses to accept loss, when conscience demands action despite legal complexity, when an ordinary man makes an extraordinary choice to honor a promise that seemed impossible to keep." She gestured toward Isaac, who stood patient and dignified despite the strange surroundings. This horse was supposed to die. Carl Henderson's business model required it. Buy animals cheaply, work them until they collapse, dispose of them before veterinary bills become unprofitable. Isaac survived only because Daniel Miller happened to be in Philadelphia on the day Henderson dumped him in an alley to die. Daniel felt the courtroom's attention focus on him. Dozens of eyes examining the simple Amish farmer who'd somehow become central to a federal fraud case. Bishop Yoder sat in the gallery with Samuel Byler and 2 other church elders, their presence a reminder that Daniel's choices reflected on more than just himself. Elena sat near the front, having convinced her mother to let her miss school for the hearing. Jorge and Maria flanked her, their faces tight with worry about the outcome. Dr. Chun waited in the witness chair, ready to testify about Isaac's medical condition and the specialized care that had saved his life. The question before this court, Patricia continued, isn't whether Carl Henderson committed fraud. The evidence of that is overwhelming. The question is whether the law recognizes that sometimes salvation comes through ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and whether love and loyalty deserve protection even when they complicate bureaucratic convenience. Judge Sullivan leaned forward slightly, her attention focused on Isaac rather than the attorneys. Mr. Miller, she said, addressing Daniel directly, this horse appears to be in excellent condition. Can you tell a court about his condition when you found him? Daniel rose slowly, acutely aware that his words would be recorded by court reporters and potentially reviewed by appeals courts for years to come. But as he looked at Isaac calm, trusting, alive, the legal complexities seemed less important than the simple truth he'd lived for the past 6 weeks. Your Honor, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his chest. When I found Isaac in that alley, he was dying. His ribs were showing, his eyes were dull, and he barely had the strength to lift his head. The veterinarian says he was maybe 24 hours from death. And what did you do? I took him home, Daniel said simply. Not to my farm, because he couldn't travel that far, but to a place where I could care for him properly, where I could keep the promise I'd made to my wife before she died. The courtroom was completely quiet, except for the soft sound of Isaac's breathing and the scratch of the court reporter's pen. Judge Sullivan's expression was unreadable, but she continued to study Isaac with the attention of someone evaluating evidence that couldn't be reduced to documents and testimony. Tell me about that promise, Mr. Miller. The new halter was hand-braided leather, crafted by Elena's uncle, who worked with the mounted police unit in downtown Philadelphia. It was sturdy but beautiful, the kind of tack that spoke of respect for the animal wearing it. Elena had presented it to Daniel that morning before court, her eyes bright with determination despite the uncertain outcome they all faced. For Isaac's new beginning, she'd said simply, whatever that looks like. Now, as Daniel finished describing his promise to Martha and the guilt that had driven him to sell Isaac, Judge Sullivan studied the horse with renewed interest. Isaac wore the new halter with dignity, his head held high despite the strange surroundings and the weight of so many eyes upon him. Dr. Chen, Judge Sullivan said, calling the veterinarian to testify, please describe Isaac's condition when you first examined him and his current health status. Dr. Chen's testimony was clinical but compelling. She described the severity of Isaac's malnutrition, the damage from months of overwork despite his arthritis, the careful rehabilitation that had restored not just his physical health, but his trust in humans. Her medical records documented every step of the recovery process, creating an undeniable record of the transformation that had occurred under Daniel's care. In your professional opinion, Patricia Reeves asked during cross-examination, could Isaac have received this level of care in a federal holding facility? Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Federal facilities are adequate for basic animal welfare, she said finally. But Isaac's recovery required more than adequacy. It required round-the-clock monitoring, specialized nutrition, and most importantly, consistent emotional support from someone he trusted. That level of individualized care isn't possible in institutional settings. The federal prosecutor's response focused on legal technicalities rather than emotional appeals. Yes, Daniel's care had been excellent, Richardson acknowledged, but sentiment couldn't override law. Isaac had been purchased with fraudulent documents, making him stolen property that needed to remain in federal custody until ownership could be properly established. The defendant acted with good intentions, Richardson argued. But good intentions don't create legal ownership. This horse is evidence in a federal fraud case, and evidence must be preserved according to established protocols. It was Elena who provided the turning point. Judge Sullivan had been prepared to hear closing arguments when Elena rose from her seat in the gallery, her teenage voice cutting through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her Spanish accent making her words sound like music against the legal language that had filled the air for hours. "May I say something?" Both attorneys objected immediately. Elena wasn't a witness, hadn't been sworn in, had no legal standing in the proceedings. But Judge Sullivan raised a hand for silence, her eyes fixed on the young woman who'd been caring for Isaac alongside Daniel. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, "but this entire case has been irregular. Young lady, you may speak, but keep it brief." Elena stepped forward, her chin raised with the confidence of youth confronting a system that seemed designed to frustrate common sense. "Your Honor, everyone keeps talking about ownership and evidence and legal protocols. But nobody's asking Isaac what he wants." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly, but she gestured for Elena to continue. "Isaac knows who saved him," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He knows who sat beside him when he was dying, who fed him by hand when he was too weak to eat, who never gave up on him even when everyone said it was hopeless. You can see it in the way he stands next to Senator Miller, the way he trusts him completely." She paused, looking directly at Isaac, who seemed to sense that he was the subject of discussion. The horse's ears pricked forward, and he took a small step closer to Daniel's chair. "Laws are supposed to protect the innocent," Elena continued. "Isaac is innocent. He didn't choose to be sold to a criminal, didn't choose to be worked until he collapsed, didn't choose to be abandoned in an alley. But he did choose to trust Senator Miller when rescue came. Shouldn't that choice matter?" Judge Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, her attention moving between Elena, Daniel, and Isaac. The horse stood calmly, his new halter gleaming in the courtroom's fluorescent light, his presence a living contradiction to the bureaucratic complications that threatened to separate him from the man who'd saved his life. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Sullivan said finally, addressing the federal prosecutor, "does the government have any evidence that Mr. Miller was involved in Carl Henderson's fraud?" "No, Your Honor. Mr. Miller appears to have been a victim of the fraud, not a participant." "And does the government have any objection to Mr. Miller's care of this animal, aside from the question of legal ownership?" Richardson hesitated. "No, Your Honor. Mr. Miller's care has been exemplary." Judge Sullivan nodded slowly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "The court finds that Isaac was abandoned by his purchaser when Carl Henderson dumped him in an alley to die. Under Pennsylvania's abandonment statutes, Mr. Miller acquired legitimate ownership through rescue and extensive rehabilitation." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Elena's soft yes. Jorge's whispered, "Gracias a Dios." Bishop Yoder's barely audible sigh of relief. "Furthermore," Judge Sullivan continued, raising her voice to restore order, "the court finds that separating this animal from Mr. Miller's care would serve no legitimate law enforcement purpose and might actually harm the government's case by destroying evidence of the defendant's recovery." She looked directly at Daniel, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Miller, Isaac remains in your custody. The court trusts that you will continue to provide the excellent care that saved his life." Daniel stood slowly, his hand resting on Isaac's neck as tears he couldn't stop blurred his vision. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with the quiet satisfaction of justice properly served. But all Daniel could focus on was the solid warmth of his friend beside him and the knowledge that some promises, however broken, could still be mended with enough love and determination to see them through. The memorial stone was simple field stone, no larger than a dinner plate, chosen from the creek bed that bordered Daniel's property where he and Martha used to walk on summer evenings. He'd carved her initials into its surface with careful strokes, working by lamplight during the quiet hours after evening chores. Below the initials, in smaller letters, he'd added a single word: promise. Now, 6 months after the courthouse victory that had returned Isaac to his permanent care, Daniel placed the stone at the edge of the pasture where Isaac spent his days. It wasn't a grave marker. Martha rested in the community cemetery beside, the simple meeting house where they'd worshipped together for 35 years. This stone was something different, an acknowledgement of the journey that had led him back to himself. Isaac grazed nearby, his coat thick and lustrous in the autumn sunlight. The horse moved with the careful dignity of his years, favoring his arthritic joints, but moving with obvious contentment through grass that still held summer's sweetness. He'd gained back all the weight he'd lost during his ordeal, plus enough extra to cushion him through the coming winter. The transformation wasn't just physical. Isaac had rediscovered his voice, nickering greetings to Daniel each morning and calling out to the neighbors' horses across the fence line. He'd resumed his old habit of following Daniel around the barnyard, curious about every task and eager for the pocket treats that materialized throughout the day. But there was a new quality to his attention, a heightened awareness that spoke of an animal who'd learned not to take safety for granted. The community had embraced Isaac's return with surprising warmth. Bishop Yoder had even commented that the horse looked healthier than he had in years, an observation that carried unspoken approval of Daniel's choices. The legal victory had enhanced rather than diminished Daniel's standing in the community. Was the man who'd fought the English legal system and won, who protected not just his own animal but potentially dozens of others through his testimony. The federal prosecution of Carl Henderson's network had resulted in convictions in prison, sentences that would keep the criminals away from vulnerable families for years to come. More importantly, the case had prompted new legislation requiring more stringent documentation for livestock sales, making it harder for future predators to exploit trusting communities. Elena visited regularly, taking the bus from Philadelphia on weekends to spend time with Isaac and help with his care. The friendship that had begun in a warehouse had deepened into something resembling family, with Elena's grandmother insisting that Daniel was an honorary member of the Santos clan, and Elena claiming Isaac as her project horse in the urban riding program she joined. "He's teaching the city kids about trust," Elena had explained during her last visit, braiding flowers into Isaac's mane while he dozed in the autumn sun. They come expecting him to be skittish or aggressive because of what happened to him. Instead, they find this gentle giant who still believes in people, despite having every reason not to. The lesson wasn't lost on Daniel. Isaac's capacity for forgiveness had been both humbling and inspiring, a reminder that healing was possible even after the deepest betrayals. The horse bore no visible grudges against humans in general, despite his suffering at the hands of Carl Henderson. He approached each day with the assumption that good things were possible, that the next person he met might bring an apple or a gentle word. Doctor Chun's regular checkups confirmed what Daniel could see with his own eyes. Isaac was thriving. The horse would never be young again, would never pull heavy loads or work long days in the field, but he found a new purpose as a companion animal and occasional therapy horse for Elena's riding program. His gentle nature and patient temperament made him perfect for working with children who needed to learn that not all authority figures would hurt them. "He's become a healer," Dr. Chun had observed during her last visit. Animals that survive trauma often develop unusual empathy for others who've suffered. Isaac seems to know exactly how to respond to troubled children. The insight resonated with Daniel's own experience. His journey through grief, guilt, and redemption had left him more attuned to the struggles of others in his community. He'd become the person people came to when they faced impossible choices, when practical necessity seemed to conflict with moral obligation. His willingness to fight for Isaac had somehow given him credibility as someone who understood the cost of difficult decisions. Heinrich Muller's diabetes was under better control now, thanks partly to the medical supplies Daniel had eventually retrieved from Philadelphia, and partly to the emotional support that came from knowing someone had fought a larger system on behalf of the vulnerable. The Hospitalers had found new draft horses with Daniel's help, and young Jacob Stoltz had acquired a replacement buggy horse through a community fundraising effort that Daniel had quietly organized. The work was satisfying in ways that surprised Daniel. For years after Martha's death, he'd felt disconnected from his community's daily life, going through the motions of worship and fellowship without the emotional engagement that had once come naturally. Caring for Isaac, fighting for Isaac, winning. Isaac's future had somehow reconnected him to the broader current of life. Around and dot, as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Daniel called Isaac in from the pasture for evening grain. The horse came willingly, his hoofbeats steady on the path worn smooth by countless trips between field and barn. Daniel's own daily routine had settled into familiar rhythms again, but with a richness that had been missing since Martha's death. The memorial stone caught the last rays of sunlight, its simple message glowing briefly before shadows claimed it. Promise. Not promises made and broken, but promises kept despite every obstacle. Not perfection, but perseverance. Not the end of sorrow, but the beginning of something that might, with time and grace, become joy. Isaac nuzzled Daniel's shoulder as they reached the barn, his breath warm against Daniel's neck in the cooling air. It was a gesture of affection and trust, a daily reminder that love had indeed found a way to heal the damage that desperation and guilt had caused. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between comfort and conscience, between the easy path and the right one. But tonight, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Daniel Miller stood beside his friend in the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and burdens lifted, ready for whatever came next.